Hey team, welcome back to another episode of the Student Paramedic Podcast. Hey team, welcome back to another episode of the Student Paramedic Podcast. Today I'm sitting with Dan Cooper and we are going to have a chat about all things human performance and relating to resilience, a little bit about anxiety, PTSD, PTG, and a bit more about wellness and all of that type of stuff. So Dan has worked with the Reds. He's got a bachelor in sports science, a master's in strength and conditioning, a master's in research and integrative cognitive and physical training, a PhD he's working on with elite teams and complex training. So he is a special ops soldier as well. So Dan, I've just given you a little bit of an introduction. Would you like to introduce a bit further?
So my background goes back for just over 20 years in the military, and most of that was spent in special forces. So I'm out now. Spent a bit of time with the Queensland Reds on the back of my time in military, and now have finished up there full-time PhD and look after my kids around that. So, and then just sort of take on a number of little side projects and looking at expanding into my own business at some point.
That's awesome. So what made you want to go into looking at human performance?
I noticed early on in my career that our ability to perform on operations was heavily underpinned by our physical capacity or our physical abilities. So I started looking at how we could prepare ourselves better, and we had really high injury rates based on really big workloads, guys that would always push to the limit, and just very little recovery within the environment we're in. So I looked at how we could improve our training to both increase longevity and reduce our injuries and prepare ourselves better for what we had. And that kind of led into doing the undergrad. And then once I started learning, I kind of really enjoyed the study, went on to do the masters to improve my understanding. And then that led into sort of looking at the integration between the body and the mind. And then the answers I was looking for weren't really in sports science. So I started branching out into sort of more around how people respond to threat, how we can improve our ability to function as a human being, both physically and mentally, within these high pressure, sort of high threat environments, and then come out on the other side sort of in a better position without a lot of these issues that people find sort of when they go through, what we sort of call traumatic experiences. So sort of led me down a long path, and I'm still going down it, but it's been really interesting.
That's really cool. So you just mentioned trauma. In your definition, what is trauma?
I'm reluctant to define trauma. I think it gets overused, similar to resilience. I think it's another word that gets overused a lot. Just depending on our life and what we go through, we're going to have adversity. We're going to have situations where we're uncomfortable. We're going to see things, hear things that will make us uncomfortable. But, what I might consider trauma, someone else will consider or see that in a different context. And then what someone who might consider trauma in Australia, if you went to a third world country, like that's just life. So I think everyone has their own definition and context of it based on their experiences and how they see things. So I think everyone sort of has a different understanding or context of it. So I'm reluctant to sort of use the word trauma. I kind of use it as a basic sort of definition, but I'm not going to really go into depth with it.
No, that's fair enough. That makes a lot of sense. So as you just said too, resilience gets thrown around a lot. What's your take on resilience then?
I don't really think resilience is just an attribute or like it's this fixed state that we have. So resilience, I think, is kind of like the definition of it is to sort of bounce back after, being bent or return to your normal state after being sort of stressed. I kind of look more at it from the context of having the mental capacity or the tolerance to overcome adversity and then grow on the other side of it. Because for me, and with the experience I've had, there's no point in really going into something to return to baseline on the other side. Like I want to improve because next time I go into a situation, I want to be better. I want to be able to conduct myself at a higher level. I want to be able to overcome harder problems. And I guess a lot of that is I sort of expose myself deliberately to, uncomfortable situations or adversity in my own time. So for me, that's all growth. So it's kind of developing the skills, understanding the environment, getting the information you need to conduct the task that you're doing, making sure that you're motivated, having sort of what you're doing align with your values, and then coming out on the other side with better skills in a stronger position to take on more discomfort in the future. Because we're always going to have uncomfortable situations. We're always going to meet adversity. Things are always going to come at us, and we've got to be able to sort of lean into it, get through it, and grow on the other side. Because if we're always just thinking about trying to maintain our baseline or homeostasis, then we're never going to grow. And when something really difficult turns up, we're going to have real problems confronting that.
Absolutely. And you just talked then about, so you take, a real effort in trying to put yourself in situations where you're uncomfortable and you're trying to grow. What are some simple measures that just people in everyday life or students who are studying these degrees where they'll, probably be going to a case where that might rattle their cage or something like that? How can they start doing that in more of, I guess, a controlled environment for the purpose of growth?
Yeah, I guess it's always difficult to kind of expose yourself to the same relative amount of stress or sort of adversity you're going to see within these environments until you're out there. And unfortunately, the reality with these jobs is the first job you go to might be the worst job you'll ever see in your life. Like, there's always that potential that you could just, go to something that is, a catastrophic event. But I guess one of the big things is the expectation you have when you're going into these things. So when I was going into the military, I entered during a time of peace, so there wasn't much going on. And we deployed quite early in my career into a peacekeeping operation, which was sort of fairly low level compared to a lot of the stuff I did later on. And one of our senior guys there, he'd been to Somalia, and he set the expectation quite early that we were going to go away. We were probably going to see things that, we'd probably never seen before. We're going to see things that make us feel uncomfortable, but that's what we've signed up for. That's what we need to expect. And if we didn't like that, then maybe we should consider our career path and whether we really wanted to go. And then for me, when I joined, I had the expectation if I went away, then it was about sort of developing a lot of skills. And I always expected that if I went into a combat zone, then I was going to see things that I didn't like. So I was always aware of that. And then when I deployed into more warlike operations and things started to get a little bit more uncomfortable, then, for me, I chose that job. I knew what I was getting into. So I never really had a problem being able to cope with it, sort of thing. So I think if you go in with the mindset and the expectation that you are going to see things, but in a paramedic role, you're there to help, you're there to save the lives that you can, you're there to do and add value to what you can, then you can take away from the good things you're doing. Where if you go in there expecting that trauma is going to have a negative issue on you, you focus on the things you can't control, you focus on the negative aspects, then it will grind you down. So I think the expectation is a really big piece. And then as you're going through, you just develop the little skills as you go around, how you debrief within yourself, how you sort of reconcile things you've seen, your own emotions, and make sure you're looking after yourself so that you can recover. So, there's sort of, everyone has their own way of dealing with these things. Everyone has their own tactics, but definitely each time you're exposed to something in training, you think about, if you've seen that for real, how would you respond? And then sort of take that as an opportunity to start developing these skills.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. So preparing yourself and having that expectation. So that'd be really good for all the people who haven't actually experienced a placement yet or gone out on road, done anything like that. So you mentioned too, so taking care of yourself is really important. So what are some really good ways to do that?
Yeah, the big one's sleep. So, I think people underestimate the impact of sleep. And when you look at the science around it, I think it's around 50 to 60% of the country sort of are sleep deprived at any one point. So, everyone kind of knows the requirements of sleep. It's like 7 to 9 hours, going to bed at sort of the same time each night, getting into a really good cycle. And then if you can wake up naturally early in the morning and go get some sunlight, then that's going to do a lot of the work for you. So after sleep, it's then sort of nutrition and movement or exercise are the other two key factors. So, as a sports scientist, I promote movement and exercise over specific sort of protocols because everyone's sort of at a different relative level. So it's what's appropriate to that person based around, their lifestyle commitments, how much time they've got. It doesn't need to be excessive. It just has to be movement. And often when we're in a high stress state or we're sort of heavily fatigued, lower intensity exercise has got better value for us anyway, because it sort of flushes out a lot, or it sort of lowers cortisol. It sort of decreases a lot of the impacts that emotional trauma has on us. So often, like just a walk early in the morning or a ride or something like that, and even if it's riding to work, riding home, these sort of things. When you start looking at shift work, then it becomes a little bit more problematic because that's throwing you out of that rhythm sort of thing. So like our body likes a good rhythm. It likes the circadian cycle to be nice and neat every day sort of thing. So, when we're in shift work, that throws us out, and that has an impact on our health, wellness, our emotional reconciliation, our ability to sort of train physically, these sort of things. And it does have a fairly significant negative impact on us. So when we're in that, it's trying to maintain our lifestyle and our cycle as best we can. And then for people that sort of are exercising quite heavily, maybe reduce your amount of exercise, maybe look at the way you're eating, these sort of things, and just tweak the little things you can around that shift work so that you're still getting the maximum recovery you can. Because if you go from day to night and then back to day, you're going to be fatigued anyway. So you really need to look at what you need to add into that. Maybe, it's just a walk here and there, and try and stay as close to your cycle as you can around meal timings, other things, to sort of, so you're not in complete disruption.
That's really interesting. And considering you just said, going for more low intensity, I've heard it, you say that before in terms of, if you've had a really stressful shift or something's happened, don't go do a high intensity workout because you'll amplify that effect. Whereas I hear quite a lot as well from paramedics who say, oh yeah, we just go for a big run, or we go for a massive like CrossFit workout or whatever, and to try and, I guess, have that really high intensity to kind of like break that. And are you saying that's not the way to do it, just go more low intensity?
Yeah, the idea behind a really heavy session to sort of get out your frustrations is, it's something that I've been exposed to my whole life. Like, you've heard that a lot. I haven't looked at the specific science around that, but I know the science around low intensity exercise, when cortisol levels are raised through stress, shows that lower intensity exercise reduces that cortisol, it reduces stress. It can have a better chronic impact than high intensity exercise, but that's not ruling out a single high intensity session if you feel that's what's going to make you better. Because again, a lot of this is expectation as well. So if you think that you need to belt yourself for 20 minutes, then maybe that's the answer that day. But you can't sustain poor sleep, poor nutrition and high intensity exercise because you're just in a state of maladaptation. Like, the higher you exercise or the higher intensity of the exercise, the more stress that you apply on your body, and your body just understands stress. It doesn't matter where it comes from. So it sort of combines physical stress, psychological stress, so the occupational stress you're under, it's all stress, and our threat response just raises with all of it. So you get this accumulative effect of it. So definitely use more low intensity exercise than high intensity exercise. But if you're in a position where you just feel like getting it out, then maybe that's just what you need, that release. So again, everyone's a little bit different, but yeah, certainly probably more low intensity exercise.
Absolutely. And you just mentioned too the threat perception. What is that?
Yeah, so we sort of appear to have a basic threat response. So if you're a paramedic who's in an ambulance and you get called out to a job and it sounds particularly bad, so as you're going out there, you're going to start running through predictions in your head or perceptions of what you're going to see when you get out there. So that's the threat response in action. So it's trying to prepare you for what's about to happen. And that's kind of anxiety. So that increases cortisol, it increases changes a number of biological functions that actually prepares you to perform better when you get there. So we perform when we're in an elevated state than we do when we're at baseline, because we're more focused. Our circadian clock comes out of sync a little bit. There's some changes in some of the hormones and some of the neurotransmitters that we have that put us in a better state to perform, and it actually increases our learning post this encounter. When we get there, we sort of work out what's going on, what we need to do, what actions we have, and we're trying to predict what we can do, what our best course of action is to get the outcomes that we want. And then we go through with it. If we're overcome or the threat is higher than our level of competence, then we can run into some problems. And that's when you see people sort of freeze up a little bit because they're not certain of what they need to do, or they're overcome by the intensity of the situation. And then on the other side, we need to be able to regulate. So our threat response will sort of automatically decrease if we give it space. So problem is, if we go from one job straight into another job, there's no space. So then you get this sort of elevated threat response throughout the entirety of your shift. So then if you go and do high intensity exercise, the threat response is still up because you're still performing at a high level. So if there's no sleep or there's no adequate recovery on the back of that, then when you turn up to your next shift, the next day it's still elevated. So what was initially a positive becomes a negative because it can't stay chronically elevated, because all these changes become maladaptive over time. So we need to be able to regulate our threat response. So the anxiety, the threat response, they're not negatives. Like these feelings of discomfort that we get, it's actually a positive thing. Like we actually need that, and we often misinterpret it as anxiety rather than just our body getting into a position where it can perform, and it picks up more information that we need within our environment. So if we can sort of refocus that that's a positive and then allow ourselves space and it doesn't have a negative impact on us. But if we can't regulate it and we see it as a negative, then that actually becomes or has a negative impact on us.
That's really interesting. I've heard that before as well from another person who was talking about like things like PTSD and things like that. And they say that, you know, it is quite normal to, you know, if you look at neuropsychology, all that sort of stuff. So what will happen after a big event is that you will have these feelings, but it's fine to still have those maybe the day after, a week after. But if it's still really persistent after a long period of time, then that's when it's bad. But most people will write it off, say if they're still thinking about the case a week, 2 weeks later, that is what would be classified as like a PTSD and the symptoms that go along with that. But it was interesting that he said that, you know, those symptoms are a very normal response to what you've just seen because it's not normal. And it's interesting. What is that your take on it as well from that?
Yeah, so I don't look into it in depth because PTSD is quite a large field, and I try and work on the preventative side. So I still have an understanding of a small understanding of what happens after the traumatic experience. But yeah, there's some interesting data, or some very good data, I think from the World Trade Center when they collapsed, and they looked at whether people need interventions or psychological interventions to reduce post-traumatic stress. And they found the majority of people over a time period were able to cope and reconcile that themselves, and they went back on with their normal lives. There was only sort of a small percentage of people that needed an intervention after sort of 3 or 4 weeks. And they found that early intervention can actually create more problems. So, you know, there is some evidence out there that after people go through an adverse situation, the majority of them are able to cope with that and move on, as long as they have a little bit of space to do it. Like if you're constantly jamming stress into people, then that's when things become problematic. But yeah, like I know there's almost like a trend or a theme within sort of self-help and these sort of things that we should be focusing on happiness. But our negative emotions are almost an indicator or a compass for us when things aren't right. And if we can work out why we're feeling these things and work out, you know, what the cause is, then we can actually realign ourselves and move on. Like if we're feeling agitated or any sort of negative emotions, then there's potential that there's something that we need to correct. So, you know, focusing on what you need to correct rather than the emotion is going to give you a much better outcome.
Absolutely. And so you just mentioned too, so prevention is what you focus on. What would those components be? So you'd be thinking sleep, exercise, but then also going into more your psychological, would it be more looking at and analysing, I guess, your worldviews and the people around you and all of that type of stuff?
Yeah, I don't go heavy into the psychology because that's its own sort of field that I only know a small bit about. So, you know, I do cross over a lot of different lanes and ask a lot of varied questions, but I'm also careful about what I don't know. And even in sports science, there's still a lot I don't know there, and that's something I've been sort of specifically studying for a fair while. So I sort of look at it more around the specific stuff that I'm looking at in regard to my research, and then understanding how that translates into other fields. So the indications from there is that early exposure to relevant, progressive and appropriate threat seems to have a positive impact. And much like if we looked at it like an aerobic sort of capacity, you know, if we started training our aerobic system at an appropriate level and then slowly increased it, then it's going to respond and increase. And it's the same, or it appears to be the same with our threat response, or our ability to cope with high level threat. So we start off with a level that we've sort of gained through our previous experience in life. So someone living in sort of like Australia, we have a fairly low intensity to threat because there's just not a lot of threats within our environment, where if we grew up in sort of an African country, or, you know, like, or I grew up in Afghanistan where there's a lot of violence, then our capacity for that sort of threat is going to be quite high because it's just part of our world. It's part of the pattern that we see within our world. So our sort of baseline is always going to be based on our experience growing up. And then if our level when we go into these occupations is low, then we need to start bridging the gap from where we are to where we need to get to. And specifically in occupations like paramedics, police, fire, military, anything where you're going to be exposed to these traumatic events or be turning up as a first responder, you're potentially going to see sort of some high level trauma. So it's about exposing yourself progressively through your training and developing the skills, so once you get there, then the gap from where you were to what you're going to see has been reduced. And we don't always know what we're going to go into as well, so we sort of, if we can keep that expectation, and then it's kind of just making sure that we are reducing all the trivial threats in our life, or not worrying about the little things that we don't need to be worried about as well, because sort of it shows that, or it's been shown that a lot of our chronic illness is associated with sort of low-grade inflammation, low-grade depression, low-grade anxiety that's over a long period. And these are just little things that we're constantly exposed to. So you see a lot of that within the media, within sort of marketing, all these sort of things. They all use threat to draw our attention. So that over a really long period will start to create low-grade anxiety because we're just constantly exposed to these small threats. So you sort of got to be able to ignore the threat information within our environment that's not important and focus on the stuff that's really important to us. So it's sort of, I guess that's probably sort of a long answer, but there's sort of, it's different for everybody as well. So
Absolutely.
But it mostly comes down to preparation and sort of the way we have our expectations, what we tell ourselves, who we surround ourselves by. Resilience also has a lot to do with the environment that we're in. So if we're in an environment where we've got a lot of support, then we're able to take on a lot of discomfort, because once we reach our sort of threshold, we can draw strength from other people. Where if we're in an environment where it's sort of, we don't feel safe, then there's already threats within our environment. So anything else that we add is just going to increase our sort of threat response or the level of uncertainty or how unsafe we feel.
Absolutely. And that makes a lot of sense. So when you talk about that too, you're saying like having people with you that have those skills that you may need, or, you know, I guess they're better at something that you may not be as good at. You know, how important is surrounding yourself with the right people, with the right skills?
Yeah, it appears to be really important. So again, it's not an area that I specifically researched, but it has come up in a lot of the stuff I've looked at as I sort of go through a large body of science, sort of for the introduction and understanding from a PhD. So there's a lot of evidence that leadership plays an important role in an individual's resilience. So the sort of person who's directly above them, so a manager or a team leader or something like that, has a significant impact, because if they're a threat, then that's a threat. So no one wants to turn up to work and work for somebody that they don't like, or somebody who's making life difficult for them, because then you want to avoid going to work because you just don't want those confrontations, you don't want those battles when you get there. Where if you've got someone who's supportive and sort of is someone you can lean on, understands who you are, then you're happy to go to work, and you're also happy to go through a lot of discomfort for that person, sort of thing, because, you know, you've got a good relationship and you're happy to wear some of that burden for them. Also the people that you're surrounded by. Like if you're in a really good team, and this is sort of my time in special operations, this is one of the big benefits, is that we had really tight teams. So when we're away and there's a lot of discomfort and uncertainty, you're surrounded by people that can help you get through that sort of thing. Like everyone has the same message, has similar values, and we're all moving in the same direction. So it's really easy to be uncomfortable when you're surrounded by people that you can draw strength from. Where if you're in a team where there's no cohesion, there's a lot of friction, you're already stressed going to work. Like you're already increasing anxiety when you're on the way to work, because you just don't know how much confrontation you're going to have to deal with before you even get to a job. So, you know, those sort of environments, the organisation itself seems to play or have a big impact based around, you know, whether it's conducive to you doing your job or whether you've got to battle through organisational sort of restrictions and limitations, these sort of things, to be able to do your job sort of thing. So they seem to be heavily important or have a big impact on people's resilience sort of thing. So, it's not just the individual, it's everything within their environment that they've sort of is either helping them do their job or they've got to battle through or fight to get where they want to go. So if you're fighting your organisation and your team every day, like, you're not going to last that long before you just couldn't be bothered anymore.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so going from that, prevention side of it, talking about that expectation side of it as well, we've been introduced to the idea in an episode prior to this one about PTG, so post-traumatic growth. Do you go into a bit about that? And if you do you mind explaining a bit more about that?
Yeah, so it's not forming part of my research. Just for the purposes of a PhD, I've got to kind of keep it quite clean so I can talk about the mechanisms of change. And the more stuff you put in there, the harder it is to truly understand what each intervention strategy does. But it definitely comes up in a lot of the research I look at. I've seen it. I've came across it a long time ago. So when we would deploy, in the early days, we wouldn't really get much information. We just go deploy. It was like, all right, we got a job to do, go do it. So, and we didn't have any issues because everyone was of the expectation that we'd worked really hard to actually get to this point, and now we had the opportunity to go out and do our craft. Then years later, when everything gets bigger, obviously it gets more complex, more people involved in a bigger organisation, they started doing more, or they're talking more about stress. So you're going to go away, you might get stressed, these sort of things. And the intent is to obviously help people understand that's going to happen, help them understand that they're going to have to reconcile these things. But they never really spoke about, you're going to go away, it's going to get tough, but if you have the right skills, you can come back as a stronger person on the other side. Like, you're going to develop a bigger skill set and have higher capacity for future stress based on what you're exposed to. And I think for the majority of people that deployed, that's exactly what happened. They came back, they're much better under pressure, they're much better in a lot of these or at applying their skills in these complex environments. And a lot of them gone on to be quite successful. But it does show that when people are told or sort of briefed on the expectation that after stress they're going to grow, then they have much better outcomes than when they're briefed on after stress they're going to have complications. So it's almost as though like an implanted placebo type effect. So, or a self-fulfilling prophecy that somebody kind of puts that seed in your mind that you can either grow or you'll fold under pressure, and then they go off and they sort of get that expectation. And then we sort of have a number of biases or heuristics that we use to filter the information that we see, or to filter the information that we take notice of, because there's so much information coming in that we can only sort of analyse so much of it at one time. So somebody who is expecting to suffer from stress, they can filter the information that they're analysing based around what they're looking for to confirm that they can't handle stress, where somebody who believes that they can grow, they'll filter the information differently. They see the world differently. They see the information that they need to confirm that they can grow. And then that's including in their behaviours, in their thoughts, these sort of things. So they'll take notice of the thoughts they're having that are putting them into a growth mindset. They'll take notice of behaviours that are showing sort of growth on the other side, whereas somebody who's looking for stress behaviours, they'll take notice of the same thing, same thoughts, same sort of stress, and probably ruminate a lot more on the stressful events and the negative impacts. So I think, I don't have a complete understanding, but there's definitely some indications out there that post-traumatic growth can have a lot of benefit when we prime people for those expectations and those outcomes.
Absolutely. So a bit of confirmation bias as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. Paramedic profession, and I guess with students, it's become very competitive due to the nature that, there's not enough jobs as there is graduate paramedics. So there is a sense of people wanting to excel, which is great, which is something that we all want to do, is excel in something. But how will you specialise in, maximising human performance? What have been the best ways that you've seen that people excel, like some of the best habits or some of the best things to do to set someone up for success?
Yeah, so I guess if we're talking about academically, and again, not a path I've specifically looked at, but a lot of our behaviours will transfer across different contexts. And I did quite well at university, even though at high school I did really poorly, sort of thing. And I think that was more around my level of maturity, interest in what I was studying, and my ability to translate that information straight away and relate it to what I was doing, sort of thing. Because if you can put information into practice early, then that's going to be easier to recall and you're going to have a better understanding of what that information means. As far as the behaviours around sort of developing sort of high performance habits, I suppose we could call them, again, it's that sort of sleep, nutrition, exercise. So like they're the three big keystone habits and behaviours that we can do that are going to set us up for anything. So, like one of the reasons I didn't go to university was because I wasn't mature enough. I would have been out drinking, I would have been out on weekends. I wouldn't have put the effort in. So the behaviours that I would have displayed at the time would have resulted in poor grades or me not being very competitive coming out of university into an occupation. So, you could question whether everyone going into university straight from school is at a point where they're going to excel in university. So there's always going to be a number of people that are kind of there, but they're not willing to put in the effort. For the people that are really interested in getting a good job on the other side of it, then the behaviours again, or their ability to put in these good behaviours and then turn them into the right habits is going to be a lot better. So like if they can get their good sleep and this sort of avoid being on your phone late at night, avoid binge watching, sort of stream TV, these sort of things, so you can get to bed. So you get that sort of 7 to 8 hours, wake up naturally. Because I don't set an alarm clock, because if I set an alarm and I wake up, then maybe I'm not at the point where I'm waking up. So I'll sort of wake up naturally between certain hours of the morning, and I've got kids that sort of regulate that a little bit as well. So, get up, do your exercise, get into good routines, these sort of things. And kind of just making sure that you're putting in the effort. Like it's very hard to put in minimal effort and then look for an excuse. Like the excuse for most people not achieving what they want can be traced back to the behaviours they've set over the last couple of years, sort of thing. So, I do a lot of pursuits on my own that are quite sort of large and they take a lot of effort. And my success on those is based around the habits and behaviours I've been doing for the last 5-10 years. Like it's nothing to do in the lead up of what I'm doing now. It's the foundation I've built to achieve that success. So, I guess some people can be disappointed, but most, like their outcomes and their ability to compete for a job on the other side is probably more based around the behaviours they've set. So, it's those high performance habits. It's sort of putting in the time, making sure that you're chunking down your study, these sort of things, sort of to try and make sure you're getting that information, getting out, sort of learning what you can outside, doing ride-alongs where you can, these sort of things, talking to people, creating a network. Like it's all going to have an impact.
Absolutely. And just to mention though to our listeners, when you just mentioned then that you do, your big projects on the side, those are your massive trail treks in the middle of winter in Alaska. Is that right?
Yeah. So one I was actually should be leaving in about 2 weeks, but because of COVID, it's been postponed for a year. But yeah, that's 1,000-mile, we'll call it a race, but it's 1,000-mile walk across Alaska. I think there's probably about 20 people that will do it, and that should take about 30 days sort of thing. And that's on foot, dragging a sled. So like, that's not something I just got out of bed and decided to do. That's based on 15 years worth of sort of solid exposure to endurance, these sort of things. But yeah, like it's, I don't know, for me, I'll always expose myself to difficulty, because once you get to a good point, it's actually not that hard to overcome difficulty.
Absolutely. So when you were chatting about how important habits are and your sleep, nutrition, and all of that, so putting all of that together, it's definitely you're very qualified to talk about that then, because that's pretty significant. So I'm very mindful of your time as well. So going through that, just in our last little bits as well, in terms of what would be your summary about how people can have tools or begin to create those tools to just ensure that they are performing at the best that they can?
Yeah, so I guess a lot of it is constantly learning from everything you do. So like when I first went into Special Forces, it was quite a difficult environment to learn in. So all the feedback we got was really critical, and it's very easy to take critical feedback personally, as though you're failing in what you're doing. That's since improved a lot. So now it's more of an actual coaching environment. But a lot of people still struggle with that sort of, if they make mistakes, about reconciling their mistakes and sort of not owning that as a personal fault of yours or an inability that you have. Like some people just make mistakes. Sometimes you didn't have the information that you needed to. Sometimes you didn't have the experience you needed to. You may have missed some vital information because of under pressure. We sort of filter our environment again for the information that we need. Like when we're under threat, we see a lot more threatening information. So it's a lot easier to miss task relevant information. And in sort of a paramedic setting, when you're doing your triage, you may miss an important piece of information just because you didn't see it. Like it's not that you're not able or you don't have the competency. You may have just missed it because there was a lot going on. You know, in these environments, there's a lot of people moving around. There's a lot of stressed people. You know, you're under pressure because everyone wants to be treated first. So, you know, like if you make a small error, then understanding that you can learn from that. That's not the end of the world. You just made an error. So, you know, when you turn up to another event that might be similar, you've got a better understanding now based on your previous experience if you've used it as a learning environment. So, you know, you're going to approach things with a little bit of curiosity. So, like you're not always going to have the answers, but you can certainly improve your knowledge and your understanding every time you go into a situation and come out of it. So it's sort of having that expectation that every job is an opportunity to grow, an opportunity to learn. And then once you make an error, learning from it. So think about, you know, what led to that error, what you could do better next time, asking yourself some sort of open-ended questions about, you know, what did you see, what did you miss, what do you need to look for next time, so that you're sort of running your own learning post-event and then sort of moving on, because you don't want to carry that with you for too long because you just start to ruminate, and that can increase the duration that your threat response is elevated as well, just through your rumination. So then sort of making sure you can align your lifestyle as best you can around your shift work, and it's not always easy. Like my wife does shift work. We've got young kids, so for her there's a lot of complications around making sure that she can get good habits, but you can always do the best you can with what you have. So, you know, you can make the most of any situation rather than just thinking there's not much I can do, so why bother, because then you've set yourself up for failure straight away. So, you know, you kind of need to earn the right to be successful through what you're doing and what you've been doing over the long term. You know, making sure you're looking after yourself, because if you're not looking after yourself, you can't look after anybody else. So making sure that, you know, at times you may prioritise your own welfare sort of thing. And that's not being selfish. That's just making sure that you're in a position where that you can then go out and you're in a better space where you're more capable of working at your highest level of competency sort of thing. So, you know, there's a number of different things. None of them are sort of really difficult. It's just sort of aligning the little things to make sure that you don't have to worry about the big things, and then sort of understanding that your mental resilience isn't a fixed capacity. Like there's a lot that goes on. There's going to be periods where you're really tired, you might be hungry, and your resilience is going to be down. Like your ability to take on uncomfortable situations is going to be down because you just don't have the energy to deal with it. Like your body is just going to look for, or subconsciously you're going to look for survival sort of cues, and you're going to avoid difficult things, you know. So having an understanding of how you're going to work when you're in those situations, and then leaning on other people. And then, you know, there's times where you're going to be in really good condition and you're going to be really tolerant to adversity sort of thing. So it's going to fluctuate, you know, as you go through your career, you're going to get better at it sort of thing. So, and then leaning on the right people when you need to, making sure you've got that support network. Also having something else outside of your job, so that third space that they talk about where you can go, and that's just, you know, your part of the world where you can recover, you can spend some time with you sort of thing. So, you know, you're enjoying your life, because a big piece of being here is the fact that we actually enjoy what we're doing, not just bogged down in our work and our career and these sort of things. So, you know, so sort of looking at your life as a whole sort of life. So looking at every piece of it, and then making sure that you're doing your best you can in all those spaces, and then sort of not worrying about the little things, not worrying about too much about making comparisons against other people, these sort of things, because they're all just threat stuff. So, you know, reducing as much threat as you can and creating as much opportunity within what you're doing as you can, sort of thing. That's going to have a massive impact.
That's awesome. That was a really great summary. That makes so much sense. And yeah, absolutely. I really love that third spacing idea. You know, some people might find what would be some third spacing options for other people?
Yeah, so this comes down to the individual. Like it's purely an individual thing. So like for me, the third space regularly when I was at work was just cycling. So I used to cycle from home to work, from work to home. And I was in Perth, so the cycle path was along the beach. So I'd cycle like literally, at one point it was 10 kilometres, another point it was 20 kilometres. So just 20 kilometres of bike path along the beach. So like it's difficult to be upset when you're riding home with the setting sun next to the beach. So like for me, that was always an easy third space. So, you know, the first 5Ks I might be thinking about something happened at work, because there's always something goes wrong every day. You know, it's easy to sort of leave work and think about the mistakes you made or the problem that's coming up, or, you know, you've got to go home and tell your partner that you've just got to cancel your holiday or something. You know, there's always issues. So the first 5Ks or 10 minutes might be thinking about that, and then it'd sort of just wash off, and then I'd sort of start to just let my mind go, think about whatever. And then the last bit was just almost, you know, riding without thought. And then I'd get home. By the time I got home, I was ready to go home or ready to be home, sort of thing. So I was always big on not walking in the door with work, sort of thing. So, you know, it's almost like you get to the door and you wipe your feet before you come inside, because you don't want to bring that into your house. And then, you know, when I'd ride to work, if I was having sort of a tough time at home, sort of thing, and you go through sort of goods and bads at home, I'd wash that off before I got to work, so I'm not taking home problems into work, sort of thing. So like, that was always a big space for me. Training's always been a big thing for me as a third space. Sport, now it's sort of kids, a few different things, but, you know, it could be anything. I know people that use music, people that use all sorts of things as this third space. It's just a hobby or something you enjoy. Like, everyone enjoys different things. It's just something you enjoy, making space for you.
Absolutely. No, that's really interesting. So, no, I do appreciate you coming today. I'll probably wrap it up there just so that our listeners can digest everything that that they've heard. It's been amazing. Thank you so much. Is there anywhere that our listeners can go and find you to learn more about you and what you're doing?
Yeah, so I've started to become active on social media, sort of thing, after a long time of not being on social media. So, you know, I'm one of those old guys now that's learning technology, so to speak. So I'm on social media or Instagram under Dan Cooper _MSC, and I post a lot of sort of videos on there, a lot of information stuff, some research findings. Like, it's not all referenced, but everything I post actually comes back from some evidence based. I'm not just on there, you know, talking shit. I'm on LinkedIn, Daniel Cooper, Facebook, and I've got a website that I'm building, www.comanche.com.au, where I'll start posting a lot more sort of high level research stuff, that sort of thing.
That's awesome. Well, thank you. And I hope our listeners, you know, go and check you out so that they can learn more about what you do and learn more about this. So thank you so much.
Yeah, no, it's been a real pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Student Paramedic Podcast. You can connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, or you can email us at thestudentparamedicpodcast@gmail.com.